Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. I came upon this pretty interesting debate between Eric Hernandez and Skylar Fiction. Eric Hernandez and Skylar were debating on the merits of theism, and I think Eric did a really solid job here. And so we're going to listen to some of this debate, offer a little bit of commentary, and do more. I've got even more in store for you today, so hang on.
All right, yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks, Skylar, for coming on. And to just kind of jump right in to take advantage of the time. So the line of reasoning that I'll be using for the topic of the question that we have is a rule of logic that'll be known as Modus Tollens, which can be summed up as a notion that if belief A leads to belief B, but if we know that belief B is false, then it must follow that belief A must be false as well. So in order to answer the question, are there any good reasons for or against theism, I'm going to kind of do something that's going to cut both ways. Basically, I'll argue that if atheism is true, it would lead to certain beliefs. And by atheism, I am defining it as the belief that there is no God. If Skylar wants to give a different definition later, that's fine. But just for the sake of conversation, I'm letting you know how I'm defining it up front.
He's doing that because some people call themselves lack of belief theists, and the lack of belief theists idea came out, I believe, in the 1970s. And this basic idea says that if they lack a belief, then the burden of proof of showing evidence of God is shifted over to the theist.
So, first thing I want to talk about is the argument for reason, or what's sometimes referred to. Alvin Plantinga has an evolutionary argument against naturalism, and it would go kind of as follows. To give an illustration to start off with, suppose you wake up one day from a nap and you see the microwave says 12 o'clock, and on that basis you form the belief that it is 12 o'clock. But then you feel that it's really hot in your house, you see that there's water under the fridge, and then you see that the microwave is actually blinking 12 o'clock, and you come to the conclusion that, the power must have gone out. Now the question is it 12 o'clock? Well, I don't know. It could be 12 o'clock because, as they say, a broken clock is still right twice a day. But the point here is that if your belief that it is 12 o'clock is based on the reading of the microwave, and given that the power has went out, then you now have what's called an undercutting defeater for the validity and truth of any belief that is based on the reading of the microwave. Now, in the same principle, if there is no God and atheism is true, then the only way to explain how we got here, our existence, is by naturalistic evolution, by the mechanism of natural selection. And again, for the sake of time, that would basically mean that if our beliefs and behaviors play any role in this evolutionary process, the natural selection is going to select for adaptive behavior that are produced by beliefs which grant survival value, which is basically to say that natural selection doesn't care whether or not your beliefs are true or false. It merely cares that your beliefs help you to adapt and survive.
Now, this is an excellent point that he just made right here. And just consider this, people. Evolution doesn't explain our origins, meaning, objective morality, purpose. It also doesn't explain our search for the truth, our ability to reason, our logic. It doesn't explain many of the things that we experience as humans. Humans actually are very exceptional in that we have a lot of these abilities which animals don't. We also have the abilities to communicate with one another and to share feelings and more. So we're pretty unique as far as humans. And so Eric is sort of getting into a little bit of that.
So to give an example, suppose a car is coming towards me, and I formed the belief there's a car coming towards me, and I formed the belief that in order to survive, I must jump out of the way and I'll live. So I do that. Natural selection looks at these beliefs and sees that it produces adaptive behavior and says, check, let's go ahead and pass it on. Because those beliefs granted and produced behavior that granted survival value in the adaptive behavior. But if a false set of beliefs could equally work and give us that survival value, then your beliefs don't have to be true for them to be passed on. So
consider the fact that if somebody rapes somebody, in human society, this is morally wrong in every situation. And in the animal world, animals forcibly copulate all the time. So why is it that humans have this value that people are not supposed to rape one another? It's because we are, again, exceptional. We've also been gifted with a conscience by the Lord our Father.
So, for example, suppose I have a different set of beliefs. Same scenario. A car's coming towards me, but I have the belief that I'm Superman. And if the car hits me, it won't kill me. However, I want to protect my identity as Clark Kent. I don't want people to know I'm Superman, so I jump out of the way to protect my identity, which means that these false set of beliefs could still produce the same type of behavior, and again, natural selection could care less whether or not your beliefs are true. Now, I say that to say, just like if any belief that's formed on the reading of the microwave has an undercutting defeater for its justification and validity or truth, then in the same way, if there's no God, you cannot trust any belief that your brain produces. And if your brain produces the belief that there is no God, then that itself is a belief that is produced by your brain, which would be undercutted by this type of defeater that we have given natural selection. Now, suppose somehow Skylar could overcome this argument. I don't think he can, but let's just say that he can. Then you have to deal with another problem, that if there is no God, first of all, the most logically positioned to hold, if there is no God and the only way we can explain our existence is through naturalistic evolution via natural selection, then I would say the most consistent position to hold is naturalism. And this would be the idea that we have no reason to suspect anything non-physical exists, like angels, spirits, demons, souls, or anything like God, given that he's a non-physical entity. So when you apply this view of naturalism to human beings, human persons, then you get the view of physicalism, which is a view that human beings are purely physical objects composed of purely physical properties and states. Now, if that's the case, then nothing like a soul would exist, and then I would argue that if there's no soul, there can be no free will. To explain this, let me first say this too. Moreover, if atheism is true and there's no God, then the law of causal closure would be true. And according to the law of causal closure, every physical event must necessarily have a physical cause. Now, to explain why this is a problem, if there is no soul and there would be no free will, consider the illustration Aristotle used. He said, if I move a rock with my staff, then I know that my staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then he asked the question, what moved me? Now, I would define free will as being the originator of your will or actions. You're the first mover. So in order for free will to be possible in this situation, you have to be the first mover to move your hand, to move the staff, to move the rock. Now, you would have two options if physicalism is true at this point. You could say, well, a neuron firing in my brain caused my hand to move, to cause the staff to move, cause the rock to move. Given that that still started with me, you could say, well, I'm still the first mover, and based on the definition I gave, I'd have libertarian free will. However, given the law of causal closure, that only pushes back the goalpost, because now, given that a neuron firing was a physical event, you now have to ask yourself, and what physical event caused that neuron firing to fire? At this point, I think the unbeliever would only have two options. The first option would be to, again, posit neurons firing, but then, again, you're pushing back the goalposts, and it will eventually lead to an infinite regress, which we know is logically and philosophically impossible. So the other option is that at some point, no matter how many neurons you posit that are going to fire, at some point you're going to have to point to something external and beyond yourself and prior to yourself that caused that neuron firing to fire. But once you do that and grant that, then you are no longer the originator and source first mover of your will or actions. You are now an intermediate secondary mover, and hence free will cannot exist. So I would say if there is no soul and you're just a purely physical object, then given causal closure, free will can exist because you're not the first mover of your will or actions. Instead, you are causally determined by external factors beyond your control.
I want to just piggyback on his ideas here with free will. A lot of atheists actually do propose that we have no free will. Among them are people like Sam Harris and Rationality Rules. And Rationality Rules made a video based on the Libet studies. And so the Libet did a study where he put people in front of a computer screen, and the people watched the computer screen. They saw a couple of very basic things on the computer screen, and they were to push a certain button when something happened. And it showed in the study that there was a lag time between what they chose and what their brains responded with, and the reaction of their brains, because they were wired. And so what happened though is, so they took these choices, but the idea with the Libet study that these Rationality Rules and other people fail to mention is that they had a choice between the time they reacted and the time their brains made a decision to change their minds. And so that would indicate free will. So actually the Libet studies go to show we have free will. And numerous studies after the Libet studies have indicated that. However, I noticed for some strange reason, atheists keep referring to the Libet studies. It kind of reminds me of something very similar with a certain Matt Dillahunty, because what Matt Dillahunty does is he keeps going back to this Gregory S. Paul univariate study to try to indicate that atheism has some positive benefits by pointing out to places such as Northern Europe, where people have higher levels of atheism and pretty high levels of happiness. Of course, he excludes the idea of, when it's a univariate study, it means it's not looking at other factors. It didn't involve other factors that could play a significant role, such as wealth, income inequality, all that kind of stuff. So it's cherry picking to an extreme. So let's go back here.
Now, I don't know Skylar's position on free will, but someone might say, who cares? Well, if free will cannot exist, you're also going to have to give up something like rational responsibility and intellectual integrity. Here's what I mean by that. So Skylar doesn't hold to a belief in God, and I would assume he would say that it's because of the evidence, perhaps. But this would assume a type of intellectual integrity, which is to say it would be assuming that he was free to examine the evidence, freely come to his own conclusion, and freely rationalize throughout this process. However, if given what I've said is true, and there is no free will, and there can be no free will if there's no God, then every belief that he is hold to was a belief that he was causally determined to believe by prior factors and events beyond his control, which means that his very belief that, or his lack of belief that there is no God, or his, however he wants to hash it out, it would literally mean that these beliefs are merely beliefs that he was causally determined to believe, and he could not have believed otherwise. And for the atheist, it would literally mean that their very decision to become an atheist was not a rational, it was a non-rational, non-intellectual decision that they made, that they were determined to make and could not have made any other choice. So all the beliefs are causally determined, including the actions. So we could reiterate by saying this. Simply put, if atheism is true, or there is no God, then given the conditions I've laid out, free will cannot exist. However, if free will does exist, then it would follow atheism cannot be true. So basically, if Skylar wants to take intellectual credit for his beliefs and wants us to believe that he freely has rejected the belief in God for rational or even moral intellectual reasons, then it would also assume this was based on his ability to freely examine the evidence and freely come to his own conclusion. But if that's the case, free will exists, and therefore atheism cannot be true. Now, based on the two arguments I've laid out so far, it would also follow that, and I'm just for the sake of time, I can unpack this later, it would follow that one could never rationally justify the truth of their beliefs. And without a rational justification, I would argue that you cannot have knowledge, so knowledge would be impossible. So again, we could say that in a similar way, if atheism is true, then knowledge is impossible. However, again, if Skylar wants us to believe that he knows anything at all, including the fact that he doesn't know everything, then it would follow that knowledge must exist, and if knowledge exists, as a result, atheism cannot be true. Again, even if he could overcome that argument, then he would still have to deal with something like consciousness. Now, given what I've just mentioned, if atheism is true, given natural selection or naturalistic evolution, if physicalism is the most logically consistent position to take, then you would have to say that consciousness, if it exists, would have to be reducible or identical to something physical like the brain, which means that if consciousness exists, the mind is nothing more than a reducible to the brain. Now, we can put it this way: if atheism is true, consciousness must be physical, but if consciousness is not physical, then atheism can't be true. Now, how do we know that consciousness is not physical? Well, based on something known as Leibniz's law of identity, which basically states if two things in question are the same, then they're going to share the same properties necessarily. To give a quick illustration, suppose I walk into a lab and I see two bottles of clear fluid. One is labeled water, the other is labeled chemical X. And I ask myself, are they the same substance? Are they identical? Because in philosophy, identical means literally the same thing as. Well, I notice they have the same property of being a clear fluid, so I think they're the same thing. But then I turn them over and I see that chemical X says caution flammable. And I think, I know water's not flammable. Therefore, even if I don't know what chemical X is, I know they cannot be the same substance or not identical. In the same way, if the mind is nothing more than the brain or reducible to it, then they would share the same properties. But we know that's not the case. How so? Take a state of consciousness such as your thoughts or beliefs. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false, but no region of my brain is true or false. My neurons aren't true or false. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm having a debate with Skylar doesn't weigh 3 pounds. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the taste of banana or the smell of a rose is not 7 inches long, and that's in my mind. I can go on, but the principle is simple. Namely that if all the properties of the mind are non-physical and all the properties of the brain are physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it can't be physical. And if Skylar is conscious and consciousness is not physical, then he shouldn't be an atheist. So I just say in summation, given what I've laid out so far, we could say that if Skylar has any reason to trust in his rational abilities in any sense, my first argument, and if he wants us to believe that he freely came to his lack of belief in God, a rejection of the belief in God, on the basis of freely analyzing the data and following the evidence freely where it leads and freely coming to his own conclusion, my second argument, and if he believes he's conscious, my third argument, then atheism, the belief that there is no God, cannot be true. And if atheism is true, then it must follow that therefore God must exist.
Excellent argument. And so what we're looking for here after we see this argument is for Skylar to rebut basically all of his points. But rather than rebut his points, he's going to take a different approach. I'm actually not sure he understood what Eric was even saying here. So this idea of naturalism is pretty important, and the idea of being reducible to the same, using the law of identity, as he mentioned. So if you have everything's explained by the physical, everything's explained by the natural, then you can't understand things like consciousness that far exceed the natural. Consciousness is beyond just the brain. And our free will, the fact that we have free will, is something also that many atheists have decided that we must not have free will, that we're simply products of our biological composition, which is a rather ludicrous idea, but of course it frees them up from having any accountability. So let's go on and see what Skylar's tactic will be here.
Thanks so much, Eric. We will now kick it over to Skylar for his opening statement. That was just about 10 minutes. So, Skylar, thanks so much for being here. Do want to let you know, before you get started, Skylar, I want to mention to everybody out there, I have put the links for both of these gentlemen in the description. So that way, if you're listening and you're like, I like that, you can hear plenty more just by clicking on those links below. Also, want to let you know, as I had mentioned, we are a nonpartisan platform, and though we are pretty laissez-faire in the sense that we only have like one strict rule, which is no hate speech. Like that'll get you banned, well, deleted obviously. We do want to ask, and I think 99% of you do a superb job at this already, which I just give you huge thanks for, is that you be your friendly selves, as sometimes once in a while it gets kind of pretty heated in a live chat. And we're kind of like, hey, we'll be patient and we're not going to be like super strict on this. But we ask, come on, meet us halfway. We're pretty laissez-faire. So with that, very excited to hear from Skylar. Appreciate both of you being here, gentlemen. And Skylar, the floor is all yours.
I just want to quickly mention, James is very fortunate right now because we're in the middle of this pandemic, and James looks like he has a very good haircut. Unlike my son's, I have no ability to cut hair, and my hair is starting to get long. My husband's hair is starting, but it looks like James must have the ability to cut his hair, or he has somebody who can do it who maybe lives with him or something. So he's very lucky. He's got nice short hair. Good going, James.
Hey, everybody. Bear with me tonight, folks. I got a little food poison this week. I am not feeling the best I've ever felt. But let me jump into this.
So he's giving us the food poisoning. Hopefully that doesn't taint his ability to compete.
Right. So the first thing I'm going to say is I wish you'd just taken a little time to go look at my channel because I'm not an atheist. Right. So,
of course, James also thought Skylar was an atheist, clearly, because you see Skylar Fiction, parentheses, atheist.
A lot of what your argument was based towards was that I'm an atheist that declares that there is no God. I don't know if there's a God. I really don't. Actually, I kind of hope that there is, to be honest with you. Well, it depends on the kind of God I should really kind of preface that with, because if he's like the God from the Old Testament, that God, I don't want that.
He is like the God from the Old Testament. In fact, he is God. So that's going to be something that you'll be dealing with one day, Mr. Skylar.
Other than that, I would say that I'm not an atheist, so a lot of what you were arguing really doesn't even apply to me. I would also say that what you're kind of doing is you're kind of leaving like the law of excluded middle. Basically, you're doing a similar thing to what Matt Slick does, where you create an either or, but it's a false dichotomy.
But is this your opening or rebuttal to my position? Because I thought you were going to give an opening.
Why are we interrupting me? Like, seriously, dude. Like, that's not cool.
We technically hadn't agreed. I know that it's usually customary that in the openings people don't address the opening of the other. But at the same time, it's something we didn't really actually make explicit. And so it's something that I wouldn't say we could assume, because we're, like I said, pretty easygoing here. So
I want to point out that Skylar is also not addressing the topic. And he did that in a debate I had with him. The debate was on whether or not objective morality exists. And he instead decided to try to speak to whether or not the God of the Bible in the Old Testament is moral. And so it's not looking at the question. The question tonight in this debate with Eric is whether or not we have good reasons for theism. And so, of course, Eric presented the counterpart to theism, which is atheism. So whether or not this applies to Skylar is not speaking to what the argument is, which is whether or not we have good reasons for theism. So Skylar is just trying to get away from answering Eric's points, which were very loud and clear and probably bothered him.
So we will.
This happens every time. I swear, I'm going to talk to somebody.
Well,
dude,
all
right, look, can I go back to my time, my man? Listen, here's the deal. You can get lost. Just be quietly lost, right? Don't be rude and interrupt the conversation.
Wow, already started.
You're still talking over me. So can I start over with my time? Is that okay?
I can give you it's probably like 30 seconds. So I'll give you 30 seconds back. So you got about 9 minutes.
Okay, so Skylar has 9 minutes to make a case. Now look at Eric. Eric looks like he's kind of happy right here. And so we'll see, does Skylar look at the point of the debate, which again is whether or not we have good reasons for theism. We'll take a look at that. Or is he basically going to spend his time talking about that he's an agnostic? Is he going to do that? What's the approach?
Sure. If you would, please just mute yourself, Eric, if you can't help yourself during these conversations. So the deal is
that advice would be helpful if Skylar would take it himself. I'm going to review a few of his other videos for that reason.
I could open and say whatever I'd like in my opening, right? You're not here to dictate what I'm going to say. I wasn't even going to do a very long opening, but now I'll go the whole 10 minutes for you, Eric, and I'll.
Okay, so he says he's going to go the whole 10 minutes. Pay attention to see if he goes the whole 10 minutes.
Say a lot of things that maybe you will just disagree with. But anyways, let me go back to going over some of your points here. So I'm not an atheist, which you got wrong, and you made almost a whole complete argument about.
Again, Eric was focusing on the topic of the debate, not whether or not Skylar is an atheist.
I'm not even in with naturalism. Listen, I'm open to the supernatural. I wouldn't necessarily exclude the supernatural as possible. Right? I don't see any evidence for it right now. So this kind of dichotomy, you're going to be like naturalism versus non-naturalism or supernatural, whatever you want to put in there, it's not going to work either. He made a lot of like assertions during this thing about like free wills, and if there's no free will, there's no soul. It doesn't really matter to me. I haven't really thought about determinism enough to really have a position on it. It's not interesting to me. It amazed me, like during that opening though, like it took so long for us to actually get to like an argument here.
Which is amusing that he says that, because Eric actually laid out a number of arguments there, but it's almost as if they went over Skylar's head.
I didn't hear any kind of definition of like theism, like what kind of God this, like how you're defining this general open God. There are different.
Well, he clearly pointed out this idea of naturalism versus the idea of the supernatural. And so to say theism is basically saying there is a supernatural element. And so Eric basically laid out a position of how naturalism cannot be true because it doesn't speak to many of the things that we experience, such as consciousness and free will.
Types of theism out there. I don't know how you're connecting. I don't know what attributes this God has that you're connecting with all these things that you're talking about within your arguments. I didn't hear any of that in there.
Again, I would just repeat this again, in case Skylar's listening and he didn't hear this. Skylar, he's addressing the topic of the debate. He's not addressing God's attributes. That is not the topic of the debate.
I think you make a lot of category errors, especially when you do things like some things depending. Here's what I'm going to say. You were saying about like brains and consciousness, how like if a thought is not the same thing as a brain, and since they're not the same thing, like the law of identity. But a lot of this comes down to the idea of how we define things, right? So how do we identify something? Like how do we identify a person, right? People have specific definitions for this. It may be different. My specific definition may be different from yours, right? So when we get into these ideas of the law of identity, we're really going to have to get in the weeds here and talk about how we're identifying and how these things are different or alike depending on how we identify them. I think also.
So if you look at a brain, as he mentioned, it's basically about 3 pounds, 3.5 pounds of tissue. And so you've got something like that. And so he did talk about how the brain doesn't explain a lot of the things that we think in our minds. So it doesn't speak to that kind of stuff.
What else I got here in my notes here? A lot of categorization. I think the consciousness thing is really interesting. I watched a lot of your videos. You pretty much made these same arguments against T-Jump when he did his conversation. I think that when you look at, if you think you've solved the problem of consciousness, you should write a book and get rich and famous, my man. Because
debate tactic number 1. This is a problem. Nobody knows. We don't know. That's debate tactic, Atheist 101. Atheism 101, the first debate tactic is to say, I don't know, you don't know, therefore we're not going to pay any attention to it.
This is a thing that has not been solved. Same with the problem of identity. Simply just stating God did it because the atheist, well, I'm not even an atheist.
There's not a problem of identity. It's called the law of identity.
Yes. I'm open to it. I'm open to ideas. So how much time I got left, James? How am I doing?
Got about 6 minutes, 12 seconds.
6 minutes.
So he went through his argument in 4 minutes. He did tell us he was going to go the whole 10 minutes, but we'll see.
Minutes, 12 seconds. All right. So I would hope, I wonder if when we get to the actual back and forth, I wonder if you have any of these. I'd love to see these arguments in syllogism form, so actually go through the premises. We can go step by step with it. Yeah, I'll concede the rest of my time.
Okay, so we just saw part of a debate. Now I'm going to go into a couple of other debates that Skylar has been featuring in, and we will continue. Debate tactic number 2 is not to let your opponent get any words in. Let's watch Skylar. Maybe Skylar needs that silent button, the mute button that he told Eric that Eric should have.
Okay, how is it, where does the difference, how does it change? Where does Satan's powers become limited? How do they limit the powers of Satan?
No, it's not that Satan. Right. So in the eschaton, Satan's not part of the new heavens and new earth, so he can't exercise temptations upon people.
So right now, Satan can't exercise any temptations on us.
No, he can't. We're not in the eschaton.
Okay, okay. So right now, could God stop him from allowing for him to tempt us? Could he stop us? Could he stop him? And if he could stop him, but he won't, what's the reason why he won't stop him?
Right, so my argument is, and I'm not speaking for Craig or anybody else, but my argument is that God can't stop him, not physically, but it would conflict with his moral nature, right?
Okay, why does it conflict with his moral nature? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Because his relation with the pre-heavenly world is more limited. He only can exercise, basically, he can exercise.
How is it more limited? How is it more limited?
I'm explaining. You got to give me more than 5 seconds to explain something.
Get to the fucking point.
Skylar, it's not a 5-second answer.
What on earth?
It's not a 5-second answer, Skylar.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Just
chill, dude.
I'm sorry.
Chill.
It's frustrating when I ask a direct question, right?
Good. It's frustrating for us that you're dominating this.
Answer,
it's also frustrating for us, and we're trying to be patient.
What we all do is
try to be patient.
Okay. Can I
Josh?
Can I just?
Frustrating for us. Try to be patient. Try to be patient. Commandeer yourself and relax. Chill. You can't have complicated philosophical conversations. Someone's ready to pounce on you the second you talk. You can't.
Well, just try to be more precise is all I'm asking. Be more precise with language.
But chill. Chill, please. I'm asking you nicely to chill, please. Please. This isn't fun, and this isn't really...
Let Dr. Josh go and stop complaining.
Dude, asking you nicely to chill.
Ready for Dr. Josh. Go ahead.
Let's all just take a breath.
See, Skylar is in a bit of a quandary. He has an opinion that we only have subjective morality. So in his opinion, morality is a function of the culture in which you're immersed. But what he wants to do, and he does a lot, is he goes back into the Old Testament and he tries to criticize the actions of figures in the Bible or of God. And so he's doing that here. This debate here was supposed to be about whether or not objective morality exists. And I think I made a pretty clear case. If we have objective morality, God exists essentially because God is, like objective morality, transcendent to cultures, people, and eras. And we have certain truths that we hold to be self-evident, such as all men are created equally and we're endowed with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness here in the United States. And those are also the common axioms across the world, as you can see witnessed in the United Nations. But Skylar is going to pull one of his tricks here to try to get away from the fact that he has subjective morality beliefs and try to go back and to criticize something occurring in another culture, which you can't do with that set of beliefs. Let's listen.
Wrong in what sense?
Why is it wrong what people did in the ancient past?
No, but I mean, what sense are you using the word wrong? Under my moral system? Why is it wrong under my moral system?
But how would you be able to, like, if you're saying it's wrong, and I say, well, that's just Skylar's opinion, how are you going to convince anybody that your opinion is correct when everyone's opinion holds equal value according to your moral framework?
Well, I don't believe everybody's opinion holds equal value to me. I think people's opinions have different values to me. So it's a straw man on my position.
So why is your opinion that something happened that was wrong in the ancient times, why should that matter?
It doesn't have to matter to you.
So why did you share it?
I don't. I point out contradictions. Usually when I'm talking about the past, it's within about biblical contradictions. And what I'm doing is an internal critique. You don't see me necessarily raging about like Genghis Khan on my channel and what he's done in the past. I talk about biblical contradictions and the how God is incoherent. That's what I'm talking about. And this is what I said before. This is why I'm confused. You keep saying that I'm using my own judgment moral system, but I'm doing an internal critique. I'm using your God's own moral system. That's why I put that argument up that you still have not addressed yet.
So what you're doing is you're basically taking, and I'll let you use your time to ask me those kind of questions, but what you're doing under your system, as I understand it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is you say, number one, you're a moral subjectivist. Number two, something that occurred in the ancient past is morally wrong.
No, don't say that. No, I didn't say that.
Okay, so it's not morally wrong what happened in the ancient Near East.
Morally wrong under what? My own standard?
Yes.
Are you asking me? Okay, so basically what you're saying is, Skylar, do you have opinions about what people have done in the past? And I would say yes.
Okay, so, but it's not objectively morally wrong.
Oh, of course. This is what our whole debate's on, SJ, is are things objectively morally wrong? Once again, my moral relativism doesn't demonstrate that moral objection or moral...
That was not what the debate was on. If you can even see up there in the title, it's called Do Objective Moral Values Exist? That was the title that we agreed upon, and Skylar took this into another direction. But what Skylar does is a little bit off-putting, because his approach usually is to interrupt people, as noted in the recent video that I just showed you with Craig and Caleb. And so we'll see how Skylar handles this particular part of the conversation.
Facts exist. This is a waste of time. You're literally asking me questions about positions that aren't relevant to you demonstrating what the debate is about.
Okay, we already decided what the debate was about in our direct messages.
Yeah, do objective morals exist? And this has nothing to do with objective morals existing.
So the question of do objective morality, or does objective morality exist, or do objective moral values exist, is an ontological question, basically. And so I took the approach to show ways that we can show that objective moral values and duties exist. In fact, we've got universal and objective moral values and duties. And so I showed that earlier in this debate, but Skylar is trying to take the debate down a different road. Of course it does, because now I want to get to, did what the Nazis
moral relativism has to do with moral objective. Sorry, moral relativism could be wrong. I'm answering your question. If moral relativism could be wrong, it doesn't mean your position's correct.
Okay, so did what the Nazis did in Germany, was that morally wrong?
Under my moral standard? Yeah.
Okay, so it's.
I mean, you're asking questions you know the answer to already. Like, this is weird. Like, what don't you understand? Like, what are you trying to, what's your argument?
See, what he's doing here is, again, he just constantly interrupts. So I get to have the joy of having a mute button now.
Maybe that might help, or what are you trying to get at? Like, basically, you're like, are you a moral subjectivist? Yes. Is this wrong?
Subjectivist yes. A subjectivist cannot make, I mean, a subjectivist opinions don't hold any water. They don't.
You don't have to. They don't have to.
So
they don't have to hold water.
If the whole world engaged in moral subjectivism, which is what your position is, if the whole world engaged in moral subjectivism, no one's opinion is any more valuable than other people's opinions.
No, that's not true. Well, yes, in an objective way, but guess what? That's
wait,
why do you think it? Well, the problem is, okay, go ahead, finish your statement.
No, I wasn't able to get my statement. I got my 10 minutes. You can have as much time as you want. Your 10 minutes.
Well, I thought this was you asking. If you just want a monologue, you could just take the 10 minutes to monologue. But this is where you ask questions and try to make an argument. But go ahead. I'm
trying to make an argument, but you're not letting me get my point out. Okay, so what I want to say is that if we can look back, if everyone in the world is a moral subjectivist, and everyone basically says, some people say we want to maximize well-being, some people say we want to maximize human flourishing, other people basically say we don't care about people, we don't want to maximize well-being. There are people who are like psychopaths Nazis out there. Yeah. Nazis, right. So Nazis decided what they did within their culture, from a cultural relativism perspective, the Nazis were only following orders. Remember the Nuremberg?
And following their morals. Sure.
So they were following orders. They were going against
their morals. Don't forget that part.
let's be clear on this for Skylar. Skylar, again, he has this real problem with interrupting people. Here's the deal with the Nazis. One of the reasons why Hitler convinced the Nazis that, convinced Nazi SS soldiers to gas people and to do some horrific things is because he dehumanized Jewish people in order to sear these people's conscience. He treated Jewish people as if they were rats. They ran all kinds of propaganda films on Jewish people being rats and being subhuman. And the German people were sort of duped, and a lot of them were surprised when they found out the horrors that went on in Germany. And so this idea that the Germans were following their morals is no, they were actually going against their morals, but they had a conscience telling them that this is another human life. So because they know within their conscience that killing another human is morally wrong, they decided to pretend that these other humans are not humans. This same kind of thing plays out with people who carry out abortions. They'll tell you that you're just going to get a D and C. They try to make it sound different than what you're really doing, which is murdering your child. They'll tell you that the child is just flesh, or it's just a clump of cells, and they say you'll terminate the pregnancy. People dehumanize other people all the time to get people to do pretty gross things. And so that's what we see with abortions. That's what we saw in Nazis. So I hope I've made that point. So let me move on.
Logically possible.
If you're
well,
not,
you asked what's the belief. You asked me why I believe that, and I'm saying that it doesn't seem logical. It seems like it'd be logically possible. I'm open to it.
Right, but okay, wait, are you saying you're open to it, or you're saying that you deny naturalism?
I'm open to both. To be honest with you, I could be open to naturalism or the supernatural. If I see evidence for the supernatural, that'd be fantastic. But I'm open to both of them. So I'm not. So how am I incoherent in my views?
So well, I'm confused here. You said, let's say I'm not a naturalist.
Okay, because I'm not necessarily a naturalist. I'm open.
He just wants to argue from both sides of his mouth right now. He's open to being a naturalist, or he's open to not being a naturalist. Okay. This guy hasn't thought through his position.
Okay.
I don't know all that entails. Like I said, I'm not a philosopher major, dude. So
right.
I'm open to both positions, the supernatural
sure.
and it being all natural. I'm open.
Well,
that's where I'm at.
So allow me to ask questions here. So you haven't come to a position on whether or not naturalism is true. Is that correct?
I don't know if I can completely come to that position.
It's not what I asked.
I don't know how okay. Say it again.
So are you saying that you have not yet come to a position on whether or not naturalism is true?
So let me ask you something. When I say I don't think you can come to that position, right? Doesn't that entail a no, right? Don't you think that when I say something, so why? So hold on. But why? So why would you be snippy with me and you go right back and be like, that's not what I asked? Well, sometimes when you're having dialogue with people, my man, you pick up on what they're saying. You don't be rude just to be condescending to them. So I'm just telling, this is what poisons the well, and I get more aggressive with you. I just want to let you know when you do shit like that. So the answer is James, I'll continue. Listen, here's the deal. I told you that I don't know if naturalism is true. That's my position.
Again, going back to debate tactic number one. Debate tactic number one for Skylar Fiction is I don't know. Debate tactic number two for Skylar Fiction is interrupt.
I don't know if it's possible to be able to verify it.
Gotcha. And I don't ask to get into a debate about it. I'm asking just so I can know where you're coming from. But you know what? Hey, sorry. I'll let you unpack that instead of giving just a one-word answer. Fair enough. I'll do that. So I apologize there.
No, it's no worse.
Okay. So I'm curious that if you're agnostic, I think you can only remain agnostic for so long, because if you haven't come to a position on whether or not immaterial things can exist, I would say, let me put it this way. If only physical things could exist, then it is not even logically, metaphysically possible for any kind of God to exist, any God that is non-physical. So if only physical things exist, then you could disprove Christianity. You could disprove any type of non-physical theism. Mm-hmm. But I can't help but wonder if you're doing this, even just for a hobby and spending so much time doing debates almost every week, and you haven't even thought of one of the most central issues to whether or not theism is true, I can't help but wonder how much thought you put into this.
Boom, mic drop. Wonderful. So anyway, that concludes this little exercise today. We'll do more later. Thanks so much for coming in.